When you think of the 19th century railroad tycoons, what comes to mind? Probably those top-hatted monopolists we call the robber barons, right? Well, what if that story we all know isn't the whole story? The source material for this explainer suggests the reality is way more complicated, and honestly, a lot more interesting. So let's get right to it. The classic image we have is of these all-powerful tycoons building massive monopolies, just crushing farmers and charging whatever they felt like. But was that what was actually happening? That's the big question we're going to unpack today. Yeah, that robber baron narrative is super powerful, but the historical account we're diving into, it paints a totally different picture. It's a story that's less about a single, all-powerful monopoly and a lot more about political connections, brutal competition, and, get this, constantly falling prices. Okay, so first, let's just set the stage. We need to look at that conventional view, the one you'd find in most history books. This is the foundation of what you could call the railroad villain myth. So the popular story goes something like this. Railroads were America's first big business. They used huge government handouts to build their empires, they formed these secret clubs called cartels to fix prices, and basically acted like ruthless monopolies, until, finally, the government had to step in and regulate them. Now let's see how well that story actually holds up to the facts. So where do we even start? Well, the source material argues that to really get what was going on with the railroads, you've just got to follow the money. And surprisingly, a ton of that money didn't come from private investors risking it all. It came straight from the government. Just look at that number. 200 million acres of land. That's what the federal government just gave to the railroads. And what's really wild is that almost half of that massive amount went to just 4 companies. This wasn't some free market miracle. It was a politically driven gold rush. So how did the insiders get rich off this? Well, the source lays out this pretty typical 5-step playbook. Step 1, you and your buddies start a railroad with almost none of your own money. 2, you use your political connections to get government land and loans. 3 and 4, you get even more aid and sell a ton of bonds to the public. But step 5, that was the real genius of the scam. You create a separate private construction company that you also own, and then your railroad pays your construction company insane prices. It was a perfect way to funnel all that investor and taxpayer money right into your own pockets. And hey, this playbook wasn't just a theory. The guys who started the Central Pacific, the Big Four, are a perfect example. Their leader, Collis Huntington, took $200,000 to Washington for lobbying. He came back with no money left, but he had something much better. A federal charter that gave them 9 million acres of land and $26 million in bonds. See, the real business wasn't running a railroad, it was playing the political game. Here's exactly how that construction scam worked in the real world. The founders of the Central Pacific paid their own construction company $79 million for work that was only estimated to cost about $43 million. And at the Union Pacific, the insiders used a firm called Credit Mobilier to overcharge their own railroad by a mind-blowing $50 million, completely fleecing their investors. How did they get away with it? Well, through some pretty blatant political corruption. This quote here is from a sitting congressman, Oakes Ames, who was also a promoter for the Union Pacific's construction company. He openly admitted to giving shares in his profitable side hustle to other key members of Congress to make sure they'd vote the right way. He even had a future president on his list. Okay, so if the big fortunes were made through subsidies and these insider deals, what about all the fuss over prices? The public was outraged about unfair rates. But the source argues that the reality of railroad pricing was way more competitive and, well, complicated than the whole monopoly story lets on. You can see why farmers and merchants were furious. I mean, why did a short trip cost more per mile than a long one? Why did the big companies get special discounts? And what was the deal with these secret rebates to their favorite customers? To the public, it just looked like a powerful monopoly flexing its muscles. But here's the economic logic that the source points to. Charging less per mile for long trips wasn't just random. You have these high fixed costs like loading and unloading, and on a long trip, you can spread those costs out over way more miles. That makes the per mile rate cheaper. Plus, you had fierce competition on those major routes between big cities, and that drove prices down even more. And what about those secret rebates? This is where the source presents a really counterintuitive idea. It argues that rebates weren't a sign of monopoly power at all. They were the main way railroads competed with each other.
In this cutthroat environment, instead of officially lowering prices for everyone, they'd secretly offer discounts, rebates, to steal big customers away from their rivals. It was proof of intense competition, not a lack of it.
So, here's the kicker. Despite all the complaints about high prices, the actual data shows that freight rates were falling, and falling dramatically. As you can see here, the cost to ship pretty much everything, from wheat to beef to manufactured goods, just plummeted in the decades after the Civil War. And for a really dramatic example, just look at the Rate War of 1876. The competition got so insane that freight rates from Chicago to New York dropped by an incredible 85%. That's not a stable monopoly. That's a market defined by brutal price wars.
So this brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. If competition was so fierce, why do we always hear about railroad cartels? Well, the railroads certainly tried to get out of the constant price wars by teaming up, but as this analysis explains, those attempts were almost always doomed to fail. So in the railroad world, these cartels were called pools. And the idea was pretty simple. Competing companies would agree to act like one big monopoly. They'd all raise prices together, limit service, and then they'd split all the extra profits. Sounds good for them, right? But here's the thing about voluntary cartels. They're inherently unstable for two big reasons. First, you've got internal pressure. Every single member has this huge incentive to cheat on the deal by secretly cutting their prices to steal business from their partners. Then there's external pressure. As soon as the cartel manages to raise prices, those high profits act like a magnet, attracting new competitors who can swoop in, undercut the cartel, and steal all the customers. And this pattern of failure is exactly what you see when you look at the history. The Iowa Pool of 1870, it was full of cheating and it just collapsed. The big trunk line agreements in the 70s and 80s, they repeatedly fell apart and turned into these bitter rate wars. As one insider wrote in 1884, their big cartel was, quote, all in ruins. The source even reframes one of history's most notorious robber barons, Jay Gould. In this telling, he wasn't a monopolist at all. He was the ultimate cartel wrecker. They called him a rakebuster, a guy who was always on the lookout for bloated, high-priced cartels that he could destroy, either by cutting prices or just building a brand new railroad to compete with them. So let's just pull this all together. The crucial takeaway from this analysis is that the real story seems to be the polar opposite of the monopoly myth. The evidence points to an industry that wasn't defined by monopoly power, but by relentless competition, consistently falling prices, and cartels that just kept failing. And that leaves us with one last really provocative question. If the market was already full of fierce competition and falling rates, and if the railroads' own attempts to collude kept blowing up in their faces, who actually benefited from government regulation? Why was that seen as the answer? That is definitely something to think about. Thanks for watching.